Families are meant to be a source of love, loyalty, and support, but sometimes, behind the closed doors of a beautiful home, they can become battlegrounds of greed, betrayal, and silent cruelty. This is the story of Harold Whitmore, a decorated war veteran who gave his youth, his health, and his strength for his country, only to return to a household where his greatest enemies were not on foreign soil but at his own dinner table. After losing a leg in service, Harold carried on with quiet dignity, providing his family with everything they needed. But years later, as age and disability slowed him down, those he had once sacrificed for began to see him differently. To his wife, Eleanor, he became a shadow of the man she once married. To his son, Richard, he was an obstacle standing between him and an inheritance. To his daughter-in-law, Melanie, he was nothing more than a burden, a cripple consuming resources better spent on her comforts. What none of them knew, however, was that Harold was far from broken, and when the will was finally read, the truth would expose every hidden betrayal. The clock in the Whitmore dining room ticked louder than usual that evening, its steady rhythm cutting through the silence like a reminder that time was always moving forward, whether we wished it or not. Harold Whitmore sat at the far end of the long oak table, his back straight despite the weight of years and the ache in his body. His prosthetic leg, strapped carefully in place, pressed against the wooden chair, and though the pain had become a companion over the decades, tonight it felt heavier. He shifted slightly, the metallic joint clicking faintly beneath the tablecloth, but no one noticed. Or rather, they noticed, but pretended not to. Across from him sat Richard, his only son, in his 40s now, with the sharp features Melanie. She glittered with jewelry that Harold had unknowingly paid for diamond earrings, a bracelet that caught the chandelier's glow, a gold chain she adjusted every time she spoke, as if to remind everyone of her possession. Beside Harold, his wife Eleanor pushed peas around her plate without ever lifting her eyes to him. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. Shame, resentment, and distance. She had once been a young woman with bright eyes and laughter that filled rooms, but decades of disappointment had dimmed that light. Now, she sat across from her husband as though he were not her partner but an obligation she could not shake. It was Richard who broke the silence. "You know, Dad," he began, his tone casual but dripping with condescension, "we've all been thinking. It might be time to settle some matters. You're not getting any younger, and let's face it, your condition doesn't exactly make life easy." Harold's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, deliberately, as though every movement carried weight. "My condition?" Harold asked quietly. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay a current of steel. Richard smirked, glancing at Melanie, who gave him an approving nod. "Yes, your limitations. You can't drive anymore. You can barely walk without that contraption." "You shouldn't have to carry all this responsibility. Maybe it's time to think about handing over the finances, the property, the well, the important decisions to someone more capable." Melanie leaned in, her voice sweet and poisonous. "We only want to help, Harold. You've done so much for this family. But isn't it time you let us take care of things? You shouldn't be burdened." The word stung. Burden. It clung to Harold's ears like a curse. He looked at Eleanor, hoping for her to speak, to rise in his defense, to remind their son of all Harold had endured for them. But she kept her eyes lowered, lips pressed into a thin line. Not agreement, not protest, just silence. The betrayal was louder than Richard's insult. Harold's grandson, little Oliver, barely 10, laughed without understanding, stabbing his fork into a pile of peas. Grandpa's slow. he said innocently. Dad said so. The room froze for a moment. Harold's heart clenched not at the insult, but at the ease with which poison passed from father to son, staining innocence with contempt. Richard chuckled, ruffling his boy's hair. Kids say the truth, don't they? Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He did not shout, did not argue, did not defend himself. Instead, he let silence fill the room, a silence sharper than any blade. Finally, he said, his voice low but firm, I see. That was all. He picked up his spoon again and continued eating as though nothing had been said. But inside, something shifted, a door closed, a vault locked, and the soldier in him stirred awake. Later that night, Harold retreated to his study, a room filled with the remnants of his past. Military medals, photographs of younger days, shelves lined with books and files. On the desk sat a small wooden box, his private safe, where he kept documents more valuable than gold. His life insurance policy, his will, and letters only he knew about. He reached for the box, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. The lock clicked open, but as he sifted through the papers, his stomach tightened. Something was missing. The life insurance policy gone. He sat back slowly, his eyes narrowing. No scratches on the lock. No signs of forced entry, which meant someone had used a key. Or worse, made a copy. His chest tightened. There were only two possibilities, Richard or Eleanor. The betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was fact. The next morning, Harold moved through the house with practiced patience, watching, listening. He caught the flicker of a glance between Eleanor and Richard when Harold entered the kitchen. He noticed the way Melanie hushed her voice when he walked past the hallway. He felt Oliver's eyes on him, studying, mimicking his father's disdain. At breakfast, Richard tried again. Dad, about the will. It's important to have things settled before things get complicated. No. Complicated? Harold asked evenly. Well, you never know. Health can turn in an instant. Isn't it better to avoid confusion later? Melanie smiled as she passed the jam. We just don't want to see things fall apart. Harold studied them quietly, then nodded once. You're right, he said softly. Richard blinked in surprise. I am? Yes, Harold replied, his tone measured. Things will be settled, but in my own time, in my own way. Melanie's smile faltered. Richard shifted uneasily. Harold returned to his coffee, the faintest flicker of a smile on his lips. They thought they had cornered him, but they had forgotten one thing. War had taught him patience, and patience was sharper than rage. That evening, Harold sat in his study, staring at the folded flag from his service days. His hand lingered on the fabric as he whispered to himself, If they want war, they'll have it, but it will be my kind of war. And with that, the first battle lines were drawn. The next few days passed in a blur of silence. Harold noticed it more keenly now, the hushed whispers when he entered a room, the quick glances exchanged between Richard and Eleanor, the way Melanie's voice carried a forced sweetness that barely masked calculation. He had lived long enough among soldiers to know the signs of conspiracy. This house no longer felt like a home. It was a battlefield, and every smirk, every silence, was another shot fired. One evening, as Eleanor cleared the dinner table, Harold lingered in his study. The lamp cast a small circle of light across his desk, illuminating his journals, his old army notebook, and the black recorder he had just purchased. He turned the recorder over in his hand, its small size almost laughable compared to the weapons he once carried. But he knew better. Words could destroy faster than bullets. and he intended to capture every one of them. He tucked it beneath a stack of papers in the corner of his study, its red light blinking faintly. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. Hours later, when the house had grown quiet, he returned to check the device. His heart pounded as he pressed play. At first, the sound of footsteps and muffled shuffling filled the room. Then came voices. Melanie's sharp whisper, "He's hiding something. I'm sure of it." Richard's reply, low and urgent. "Then we push harder. He can't hold out forever. The will has to be updated before it's too late." Before it's too late. The words sank deep into Harold's chest, colder than the desert nights he once endured overseas. Too late for whom? He listened further. Melanie again. What if he refuses? What if he leaves it all to someone else? Richard's voice hardened. "He won't! He can't! He owes us! After everything, it's ours by right. And if he won't give it willingly..." The recording cut off with footsteps, but Harold didn't need to hear more. He had his first piece of proof. The following day, Harold rose earlier than usual. Eleanor was still in bed, her breathing steady, or perhaps only feigned. Harold couldn't tell anymore. He strapped on his prosthetic, the familiar weight grounding him, and left the house quietly. The winter air bit at his face as he walked slowly down the street toward the bus stop. His son had insisted he stop driving months ago, saying it was for his safety. The truth was clearer now. Richard wanted control, even of Harold's movements. But Harold hadn't lost his independence, not yet. On the bus, he sat by the window, watching the town pass by. The bakery he once took Eleanor to when they were young. The corner store where Richard had bought his first baseball glove. The courthouse looming in the distance like a stone sentinel. His destination was a small office near the courthouse. The brass plaque on the door read, "Arthur Jennings, attorney at law." Arthur had been a fellow soldier once, a man Harold trusted more than his own kin. Time had turned them into different men, Arthur into a lawyer, Harold into a weary veteran, but loyalty ran deeper than careers. Arthur looked up from his desk as Harold entered. His eyes softened with recognition. "Harold," he said, standing to shake his hand firmly. "It's been too long." Harold sank into the chair opposite. "Too long, yes, but I'm afraid I'm not here for a reunion." Arthur studied him, his lawyer's instincts sharp. "What's going on?" Harold leaned forward. "My own blood is circling me like vultures. They think I'm finished. They're wrong. I need your help." Arthur listened as Harold described the dinner insult, the missing policy, the recording. His jaw tightened with every word. "Guardianship," Arthur muttered at last. "That's where this is headed. They'll try to prove you're unfit, then strip everything you own while you're still breathing." Harold nodded. "Then I need proof more than just my word against theirs." Arthur leaned back, crossing his arms. "You've always been a strategist. Don't let anger cloud your judgment. Gather evidence. Document everything. When the time comes, we'll strike, but we'll do it legally, not emotionally." A faint smile tugged at Harold's lips. "Patience has always been my sharpest weapon." Arthur returned the smile. "Then sharpen it, Harold. This isn't the battlefield we knew, but the stakes are just as high." Back at the house, Harold moved with new purpose. He placed another recorder in the living room, hidden beneath the cabinet near the dining table. Each night, after the family retired, he retrieved the device and listened. What he heard confirmed everything. Melanie's voice, dripping with contempt. "He's stubborn, but he won't last. He can barely make it up the stairs. We'll keep pressing until he breaks." Richard's muttered reply. The house, the accounts, the land, it's all ours. He just doesn't realize it yet. And Eleanor, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Maybe we should wait. Maybe this isn't the way. But Richard cut her off sharply. Don't start defending him now. You know as well as I do, he's just a burden. The word again. That cursed word. Harold stopped the tape, his hand steady, though his chest ached with each beat. He had enough to fight back, but not yet. Timing mattered more than rage. That evening at dinner, Harold sat quietly while Richard carried on about responsibilities and planning for the future. Finally, Harold set his fork down and looked directly at his son. Tell me, Richard, he said softly, do you think betrayal works? Richard frowned, confused. What? Because once a man learns betrayal gets him what he wants, he'll never stop using it. The table fell silent. Eleanor's hand trembled as she set down her glass. Melanie shifted uncomfortably. Oliver stared, sensing tension but not understanding. Harold smiled faintly and returned to his meal as though nothing had been said. Inside, though, he knew the war had truly begun. The winter days grew shorter, shadows stretching long across the Whitmore home. Harold found himself awake at odd hours, sitting in his study with only the lamp for company. His journals filled with notes, dates, times, snippets of overheard conversations. Every detail mattered. Every whispered plot became a weapon he would later wield. He was no stranger to strategy. On the battlefield, patience had saved his men more times than gunfire. And now, in his own home, patience would save him again. But Harold also knew no soldier wins a war alone. The following afternoon, Harold limped down the street to the old cafe near the courthouse. The air smelled of roasted beans and baked bread, and the low hum of conversation reminded him of simpler times. At a corner table sat Tom Callahan, an old comrade from his regiment. Tom's hair had gone white, but his eyes carried the same sharp fire Harold remembered from decades ago. Harold, Tom said, rising to grip his hand. You look worn but not beaten. Harold managed a smile. Beaten men don't walk into cafes. They sit at home, waiting to die. Tom chuckled, but his face turned serious as Harold explained everything the insult at the dinner table. The missing documents, the secret recordings. Tom's hands tightened around his coffee cup. Your own boy, Tom muttered, shaking his head. I've seen betrayal in foxholes, but this cuts deeper. It does, Harold admitted quietly. But I can't fight it alone. I need someone who still remembers what loyalty looks like. Tom leaned forward. You've got it! Just tell me what you need. Harold's voice was low, deliberate. I need eyes. Someone on the outside. If Richard or Melanie start making moves in town banks, lawyers, anything I want to know. Tom nodded without hesitation. Consider it done. They won't breathe without me hearing it. For the first time in weeks, Harold felt a flicker of strength return. The soldier in him was not alone. That evening, Harold returned home to find Eleanor folding laundry in the living room. Her hands moved too quickly, almost nervously, but her face remained carefully composed. Where have you been? She asked casually, not looking up. Catching up with an old friend, Harold replied. His tone was light, but he watched her closely. Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their work. Friends can be useful, she murmured. The words were innocent enough, but the undertone was sharp enough to draw blood. She suspected something. Maybe she even knew. Harold said nothing more. Silence remained his shield. At dinner that night, Richard was restless. He tapped his fork against the plate, his leg bouncing beneath the table. "Dad," he began abruptly, "we really should set a date with the lawyer. Get the will squared away. Why keep putting it off?" Harold carved a piece of chicken carefully, savoring the quiet before he answered. "Because," he said softly, "complication is just another word for opportunity." Richard blinked, thrown off. "What's that supposed to mean?" Harold met his eyes evenly. "You'll figure it out." The tension around the table thickened. Eleanor's fork froze midair. Melanie forced a laugh, her diamond bracelet flashing under the chandelier. "Harold's always been a man of riddles," she said. But Harold saw it, the flicker of unease in Richard's face, the suspicion gnawing at him. The seeds had been planted. And suspicion, once rooted, grew faster than weeds. Later that night, Harold retrieved the recorder hidden near the dining room. He pressed play, and once again, the truth spilled into his ears. Richard's voice, sharp, fraying at the edges. "He's hiding something. I know it. If we don't get control soon, we'll lose everything." Melanie's whisper. "Maybe you're pushing too hard." "What if he's already changed the will?" Richard's reply came like a knife. "Then we'll force it. Guardianship, power of attorney, whatever it takes, he won't have a choice." End. Harold sat back, the weight of their words pressing down on him. For a long time he stared at the recorder as if it were alive. They thought they were hunters. But every word they spoke, every scheme they whispered, only tied the noose tighter around their own necks. The next morning, Harold's patience was tested again. "Dad," Richard said as they stood in the hallway, "if you're moving money around, we should talk. Handling accounts is complicated. You don't want to make mistakes." Harold studied him silently before answering. "Complicated," he murmured, "is just another word for opportunity." Richard stiffened, eyes narrowing. "Stop playing games. You're too old for this." Harold's smile was faint, almost cruel. "The thing about lies, son, is that they collapse under their own weight. Truth, though, truth survives." Richard's jaw clenched. He stormed off, muttering under his breath, while Melanie followed, whispering frantically at his side. Eleanor lingered in the doorway, her face pale, her silence as heavy as ever. That night, Harold sat in his study with the flag from his service days resting across his lap. He traced the folded fabric with his hand, remembering the men he had lost, the battles he had endured. He whispered into the quiet room, his voice steady. "If they want war, they'll get one. But it will be my war, my battlefield, my terms." He closed his notebook with a snap, the sound ringing like the chambering of a rifle. The first shots had already been fired, and Harold Whitmore was ready. Morning sunlight spilled weakly through the curtains, but the Whitmore household was already steeped in tension. Breakfast, once a routine gathering, had turned into a minefield of unsaid words and veiled glances. Harold sat at the head of the table, his cane resting against his chair, the steam from his untouched coffee curling upward like smoke from a battlefield. Richard devoured his eggs quickly, jaw tight, while Melanie scrolled through her phone with feigned disinterest. Eleanor moved quietly between them, pouring juice, her lips pressed into a line. No one spoke until Harold set down his fork with deliberate slowness. "Richard," he said calmly, "have you checked the mailbox lately?" Richard looked up, startled. "Mailbox?" "Yes," Harold replied, his eyes steady. "I thought I heard the postman mention a letter addressed to you." Something official. Richard's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Harold sipped his coffee, letting the silence drag. You'll see. 2 hours later, the front door slammed as Richard rushed inside, waving a thick envelope. His face was pale, his voice sharp. Dad, what the hell is this? He dropped the envelope on the table. The words Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law, gleamed across the top. Melanie snatched it up, flipping through the papers. Her manicured nails tapped against the legal jargon. This looks like revisions. Estate revisions. Richard rounded on Harold, fury in his eyes. You went behind my back? Harold looked at him evenly. Behind your back? Number. Right in front of your face. You were just too busy scheming to notice. Richard's face reddened. You're trying to cut me out! I'm ensuring, Harold said softly, that the right people inherit what's worth inheriting. The words hung in the air like gunfire. Eleanor froze mid-step, the juice pitcher trembling in her hands. Melanie's lips pressed into a thin, furious line. The fight that followed was inevitable. You owe me, Richard shouted, slamming his fist against the table. Everything I've done for this family. Harold cut him off, his voice low but edged with steel. What have you done, Richard? Built a life? Number. You've built debt, arrogance, and excuses. You don't want responsibility, you want reward without sacrifice. Melanie stepped forward, her voice sharp as glass. Maybe he wouldn't have to fight for what's his if you weren't so selfish. You sit here, a cripple clinging to the past, when you should be thinking about the future, our future. Harold's cane struck the floor with a crack, silencing the room. His eyes burned into hers. Careful, Melanie. You mistake silence for weakness. But silence is patience, and patience is power. That night, Harold retreated to his study, replaying the recording from dinner 2 nights earlier. Richard's voice still crackled with desperation. We'll force it! Guardianship, power of attorney, whatever it takes! Harold leaned back, smiling grimly. Now, paranoia would do half his work for him. He began drafting letters, each one carefully worded, each one calculated to reach the right ears. Old military contacts, former business partners, even the family lawyer, all would receive copies of Richard and Melanie's careless words. The recordings would remain hidden for now, but whispers would spread. By the time Harold set down his pen, the storm had already begun to take shape. Meanwhile, paranoia was eating away at Richard. At midnight, Harold heard footsteps pacing the hallway, doors opening and closing. He rose quietly, leaning on his cane, and found Richard rifling through drawers in the living room. What are you looking for? Harold asked from the shadows. Richard spun around, guilt flashing across his face. I was just checking something. Harold tilted his head. Be careful. Sometimes when men search too hard, they find exactly what they fear. Richard's throat bobbed. He muttered something under his breath and fled upstairs, leaving the drawers half open. Harold closed them with deliberate calm, the faintest smile on his lips. The trap was working. Suspicion was poisoning Richard from the inside out. The next day, Eleanor found Harold in the garden, staring at the barren winter soil. She approached quietly, her voice uncertain. Harold, she said, what are you doing? All these games, all these secrets, you'll tear this family apart. He didn't look at her. I'm not tearing it apart, Eleanor. I'm exposing what's already broken. Her eyes shone with something between sorrow and fear. Richard is our son. Yes, Harold said softly. But he's not our heir. He's not the man I raised him to be. He's become something else, something you've let happen." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. She turned and walked back inside, leaving Harold alone with the cold wind and the weight of truth. That evening, Tom Callahan stopped by under the pretense of delivering a book. In the privacy of Harold's study, he whispered, "You were right. Richard's been asking around town banks, lawyers, even City Hall. He's desperate." Harold's eyes hardened. "Good. Let him dig. The deeper he goes, the faster he'll bury himself." Tom clasped Harold's shoulder. "Just be careful, old friend. Cornered men do dangerous things." Harold nodded, his gaze fixed on the window, where the last light of day was fading. So do betrayed fathers. That night, the Whitmore house was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. Harold sat in his armchair, staring into the fire, when he heard a faint creak on the stairs. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he knew. Someone was moving through the dark, hoping to catch him unaware. And Harold Whitmore was ready. The Whitmore household had become a silent battlefield. Every look carried suspicion, every word was weighted. Harold felt it in the air like the heaviness before a storm. His son and daughter-in-law had grown restless, whispering late into the night, their voices muffled behind closed doors. But Harold had fought in real wars he knew when an enemy was planning an offensive. One morning, Eleanor discovered a bottle of expensive wine on the counter. She raised a brow. "Where did this come from?" Melanie smiled too quickly. "I thought we deserved something special." Harold's eyes lingered on the bottle. Something about it felt wrong. His instincts prickled. Later, when no one was looking, he uncorked it, letting the scent drift to his nose. Sweet, too sweet. He poured a single drop onto the tip of his finger, tasted it, and spat immediately into the sink. Not wine. Something hidden beneath the sweetness. Bitter. Dangerous. At dinner, Richard poured generously into Harold's glass, his hands steady, but his eyes too sharp, too watchful. Harold lifted the glass, swirling the liquid with a faint smile. "To family," he said. He raised the glass high, but instead of drinking, he stood and crossed the room, setting it on the mantel beside Eleanor's framed wedding portrait. "Let it breathe," Harold murmured. "A good wine deserves time." Melanie's smile cracked. Richard's knuckles whitened around his fork. Harold sat back down, calmly buttering his bread as though nothing had happened. Later that night, when the house was asleep, Harold carried the glass to his study. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a small kit, an old military-issue field test for toxins, long expired but still serviceable. A few drops, a swirl of reagent, and the liquid turned cloudy green. Poison. Harold stared at it, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. His own flesh and blood wanted him dead. The next morning, Richard stormed into Harold's study without knocking. "Dad, we need to talk." Harold looked up from his writing. "About what?" "About the will. You're playing games, and I won't stand for it." Harold folded the papers neatly, his hands deliberate. "You seem agitated, Richard. Sleep badly?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't mock me." "I don't need to," Harold said. His voice dropped low, measured. "You mock yourself every time you open your mouth and reveal the man you've become." Richard's eyes blazed. "You think you can control me forever? I'll have what's mine, one way or another." Harold leaned forward, his gaze sharp as steel. "Careful, son. Threats are like weapons. You'd better be sure they won't backfire." Richard froze, a flicker of fear crossing his face. For a moment, Harold thought he saw the boy Richard once was uncertain, insecure, craving approval. But then Melanie appeared in the doorway, her presence hardening him again. "Come on," she said to Richard. "Don't waste your breath." Richard hesitated, then turned on his heel and followed her out. That evening, Harold made a quiet decision. It was time to stop waiting. He called Tom Callahan. "Bring the recorder," Harold said. "And make sure it's the good one. We're going to bait a confession." Tom chuckled grimly. "You always did like setting traps." The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Harold accidentally left his study door ajar, papers scattered across his desk, a half-written letter addressed to his lawyer in plain view. The letter hinted at a shocking change. His estate would be divided not to Richard, but to Eleanor and several charitable foundations. From the shadows of the hallway, Harold waited. It didn't take long. Melanie crept down first, her silk robe trailing, eyes darting. She rifled through the papers with greedy haste. Moments later, Richard joined her. "This is it," Melanie hissed. "He's cutting you out." Richard's face went red. "He can't do this!" "Then stop him," Melanie spat, shoving the papers at him. "Do whatever it takes. If he won't hand it over, then what?" Harold's voice cut through the dark. The lamp clicked on, flooding the study with light. Harold stood by the door, cane in hand, Tom Callahan just behind him with the recorder running. Richard and Melanie froze, like thieves caught mid-act. "You!" Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "You set us up." Harold stepped forward, his shadow long in the lamplight. "No, Richard, I gave you a chance to prove me wrong. Instead, you proved every fear I've had about you." Melanie sneered. "You think anyone will believe your twisted stories?" Harold's eyes flicked to Tom, who held up the small recorder, its red light blinking steadily. "They won't need stories," Harold said quietly. "They'll have your own voices." The room went silent, heavy with the weight of revelation. Richard's fists clenched, his breathing ragged. "You won't get away with this." Harold leaned on his cane, his voice like iron. "No, son, you won't." That night, Harold sat alone in his study long after Tom had left. The house was quiet again, but not in peace quiet like a battlefield after the first shots, when everyone knows the war has only just begun. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand steady, his eyes fixed on the fire. He thought of the poison, the lies, the betrayal that had grown inside his own family like a cancer. And he vowed silently, fiercely, that he would cut it out, no matter the cost. The Whitmore home no longer carried the warmth of a family residence. It had become a place of surveillance and suspicion. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed like a countdown. Richard and Melanie shut themselves in their bedroom for hours, arguing in whispers too sharp to be ignored. Eleanor, usually blind to their schemes, had begun to notice the changes, the hushed tones, the abrupt silences when she entered a room, the coldness directed at Harold. One morning, Eleanor lingered in the hallway as Richard's voice leaked through the door. "He set us up. He's not as weak as he looks," Richard hissed. "So what?" Melanie snapped. "We can't stop now. You want to live your life forever under his thumb? You deserve everything he has, Richard. We just have to push harder." "Push how?" Richard's voice cracked with uncertainty. "If he gives that recording to the lawyer, then make sure he doesn't." Melanie's tone was sharp, venomous. Eleanor clutched her chest. A chill ran through her. These weren't frustrations, they were conspiracies. That evening at dinner, Harold noticed his wife's silence. She pushed food around her plate, her eyes lowered, her lips tight. Richard and Melanie filled the space with false cheer, but their performance was brittle. Finally, Eleanor broke. "Richard," she said suddenly. Her voice trembled, but her eyes lifted, fixed on her son. "Why are you speaking of your father like an enemy behind closed doors?" The clatter of Melanie's fork against the plate was deafening. Richard froze. "Mother, you don't understand." "I understand enough." Eleanor's tone hardened, surprising even herself. "I heard you this morning, talking of making sure your father doesn't— What? Speak the truth? Protect what he's worked for? What have you become?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Harold sat back, watching. He hadn't told Eleanor everything, hadn't wanted to shatter her illusions, but now the cracks were spreading on their own. Melanie recovered first. "Oh, Eleanor," she laughed, too quickly. "You must have misheard. We were only frustrated about finances." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Don't lie to me, Melanie. I may have been blind, but I am not deaf." That night, after the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, Eleanor entered Harold's study. He looked up, expecting reproach. Instead, she closed the door gently and whispered, "How long have they been plotting against you?" Harold's hand stilled over his papers. For a moment, the war-hardened veteran seemed at a loss for words. Then he sighed, deep and weary. "Too long," he admitted. "Long enough that I stopped hoping they'd turn back." Eleanor sank into the chair opposite him, her face pale. "I should have seen it sooner. God, forgive me. I defended them when you warned me. I called you bitter. But Harold," her voice cracked, "they want you gone." Harold's eyes softened, but his voice carried no false comfort. "I know. And the will is protected," he interrupted. "I've made arrangements they don't know about." Eleanor reached across the desk, her hand trembling in his. "Then let me help you, please. I can't stand by anymore." For the first time in months, Harold felt the faintest stirrings of alliance. His wife, at last, was awake. Meanwhile, Richard's nerves frayed like worn rope. The recording haunted him. Every time Harold looked at him with those steady eyes, Richard felt exposed, judged, small. He turned to whiskey to dull the gnawing dread. Melanie, furious at his weakness, goaded him constantly. "You're pathetic," she hissed late one night. "All your father has to do is hand that recording to the lawyer, and we're finished. Everything gone. And you sit here drinking instead of acting." Richard slammed the glass down so hard it shattered. "What do you want me to do, Melanie? Kill him?" The words hung heavy in the air. Melanie's lips curled into something like a smile. "If that's what it takes." Richard paled. "He's my father. Number, he's your prison warden. And if you don't free yourself, he'll bury you alive." Across the hall, Harold, awake and listening, heard everything. He had learned to sleep light in the war. Every creak, every whisper, every shift in the air reached him. And now those same instincts told him the danger was no longer veiled. It was imminent. The next morning, Harold called Tom. "Keep the copies safe," Harold instructed. "I'll need them soon." "You sure you want to push them?" Tom asked. Harold's voice was calm, ironclad. "They've already pushed themselves. I'm just holding up the mirror." That afternoon, Harold gathered the family in the living room. His tone was deceptively casual. "I've been reviewing some old files," he said. "War bonds, deeds, insurance policies. It reminded me that nothing lasts forever, not even me. So I thought it wise to clarify a few things before the lawyer arrives." Richard stiffened. What things? Who gets what? Harold said bluntly. Eleanor, of course, is provided for. As for the rest, it will not be as some of you assume. Melanie's face blanched. Harold's eyes lingered on her, sharp and knowing. I value loyalty above entitlement, sacrifice above greed. And when the will is read, those values will be clear. The words struck like thunder. Eleanor bowed her head, relief mixing with sorrow. Richard sat rigid, his fists balled. Melanie's painted smile faltered into open fury. Harold leaned back, cane resting across his knees. Consider this your only warning. If you're planning anything foolish, remember, war has a way of exposing the traitors first. That night, the storm finally broke. Richard and Melanie screamed at each other in their bedroom, voices carrying through the house. Eleanor wept quietly in her room, guilt and dread twisting inside her. And Harold sat awake in his study, pen scratching across paper as he wrote his final letters that would outlive him if Richard and Melanie carried their poison to its ultimate conclusion. The house creaked under the weight of unspoken choices. By dawn, one truth was undeniable. The Whitmores were no longer a family. They were combatants. And the war for Harold's legacy had only just begun. The Whitmore estate was no longer quiet. Every hallway seemed charged with electricity, every shadow thick with secrets. Harold felt it in his bones. The same tension he'd known on the battlefield, the sense that an ambush lay just beyond the ridge. Richard had grown erratic. He paced the halls at night, his footsteps uneven, his mutterings drifting through the old house like a curse. Eleanor often lay awake, listening, her hands trembling under the sheets. Melanie, on the other hand, moved with frightening clarity. She no longer bothered to mask her disdain. If Harold entered a room, she left with a sharp slam of the door. If Eleanor tried to mediate, she cut her down with venom-laced words. And Richard, weak, desperate Richard, followed her lead like a moth into flame. One evening, Harold wheeled himself into the parlor, where Richard sat nursing a drink. "Son," Harold began calmly, "you've been restless." Richard's head snapped up, eyes bloodshot. "Restless? You think I don't know what you're doing? Dangling this wool over my head like a noose?" Harold studied him, unflinching. "You're the one who tied the knot, Richard. I only hold the rope." Richard's face twisted. "You don't understand. I've wasted my whole life under your shadow. Everything I wanted gone. You've controlled me since I was a boy." "You mistake guidance for control," Harold said. "But if you've wasted your life, it wasn't by my hand." Richard slammed the glass onto the table. Liquid sloshed over the rim, dark against the polished wood. "You don't get it. You'll never get it. You've already taken everything from me. Why shouldn't I take from you?" The words hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. Harold leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "'Cause once you cross that line, there's no way back. And I'll make sure you don't just lose my wealth, you'll lose your soul." Richard's hand shook as he poured another drink, but his eyes burned with something Harold hadn't seen in years. Hatred stripped of hesitation. The next day, Melanie cornered Richard in their room. "It's now or never," she whispered. "If we wait until the will is read, we're finished. He's already turning Eleanor against us. Do you want to be left with nothing? Do you?" Richard rubbed his face, exhausted. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Melanie leaned close, her perfume sickly sweet. "An accident. That's all. He's old, frail. No one would question it. A fall down the stairs. A slip in the bath. Even his weak heart giving out after an argument. We don't have to dirty our hands, we just have to make sure the timing is right. Richard recoiled. He's my father! No, Melanie hissed. He's your jailer, and the keys are in his coffin. Richard stared at her, sickened, and yet a part of him, the weak part, listened. But Harold was no fool. He had spent his life reading men, discerning intentions before they became action. He knew the storm brewing in his son's chest, so he laid his trap. That night, Harold left his study door ajar. On his desk sat a thick envelope labeled in bold, clear handwriting, "To be opened only in the event of my untimely death." Inside was a collection of documents, the deed to the house, insurance papers, a copy of the revised will, and a USB drive labeled Proof. It was bait, and Harold knew Richard wouldn't resist. Sure enough, hours later, Harold's instincts proved true. He feigned sleep in his armchair, his cane resting within reach, as the floorboards creaked under Richard's hesitant weight. The door creaked open. Richard stepped inside, eyes darting nervously, his gaze locked on the envelope. He swallowed hard, then reached for it. "Curiosity can be fatal, son." Richard froze. Harold's voice was calm, steady, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Richard spun around. "You're awake?" "I'm always awake when danger lurks," Harold said, shifting his weight against the cane. "What were you planning to do with that envelope?" Richard stammered. I just wanted to know." "What you'd inherit if I dropped dead tomorrow," Harold's eyes bored into him. "Or perhaps you wanted to make sure it happened sooner rather than later." Richard's face blanched. "No, I would never." Harold rose slowly, deliberately, the years of pain making his movement heavy but dignified. "I fought men who wanted me dead, Richard. I looked them in the eyes and I beat them. Do you really think I can't see the same intent in my own son?" Richard's lips trembled, but no words came. He turned and fled, slamming the door behind him. Harold lowered himself back into the chair, the ache in his chest, deep but not from weakness, from sorrow. The boy he'd once carried on his shoulders was now running from him like a thief in the night. The next morning, Harold confided in Eleanor. "I left the bait," he said quietly, "and Richard bit. He'll deny it, but he's too far gone. Melanie's poison runs deep." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "What do we do, Harold? He's our son." Harold clasped her trembling hands. "Blood does not excuse betrayal. If Richard chooses destruction, then destruction is what he'll find. But he won't take us with him." Meanwhile, Melanie fumed. Richard's failure to act enraged her. "You had the chance," she spat, pacing their bedroom, "and you froze. He's playing with you like a cat with a mouse." Richard's voice was hollow. He knows everything. I can't fight him." Melanie's face twisted with fury. "Then I will. If you're too much of a coward, I'll end this myself." Richard stared at her, horror struck. "Melanie, what are you saying?" "I'm saying Harold Whitmore's reign ends soon. And when it does, we'll finally be free." Across the hall, Harold stood quietly at the threshold, unseen. He had heard every word, and this time his heart did not ache. It hardened, because now it was no longer just Richard. It was war against Melanie, and Harold Whitmore was a soldier who had never lost a war. Morning broke heavy over the Whitmore estate. Clouds clung low to the horizon, smothering the sunlight. Eleanor set out the breakfast as always, eggs, toast, and black coffee, but the air at the table was anything but ordinary. Richard sat silent, hands clasped. eyes darting between his father and his wife. Harold, composed as ever, stirred his coffee without sipping. And Melanie? She smiled. A thin, sharp smile that seemed more like a threat than a kindness. Harold, she said sweetly, you really should be more careful. At your age, one slip could mean, well, catastrophe. Eleanor stiffened, her fork clattering softly against the plate. Harold did not look up. Life is full of catastrophes, he replied evenly. The test of character is who survives them. Melanie's smile faltered. Just a little. Later that afternoon, Eleanor insisted Harold rest. The gray sky pressed low against the windows as Harold wheeled himself into his study, Kane resting at his side. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. That was when he smelled it. Gasoline. Faint, but undeniable. His eyes snapped open. The scent was strongest near the door. He wheeled forward, his old instincts igniting. Opening the door, he glanced down and saw a thin sheen glistening on the hardwood floor, leading down the hall toward the stairwell. Kerosene. His jaw tightened. Moments later, footsteps echoed. Melanie appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a box of matches in her manicured hand. "Oh, Harold," she said lightly, as though commenting on the weather. "Funny thing about these old houses. So very flammable." "Oh." Harold's cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. "You dare bring fire into my home?" "This isn't your home anymore," she sneered. "It's ours. Richard's and mine. You've had your time, old man. The world doesn't belong to broken relics like you." Eleanor's voice rang out from the corridor. "Melanie!" She rushed forward, horrified. "What are you doing?" Melanie's face twisted into something unrecognizable. "Saving us. From him? Can't you see? He'll never let us live. He'll strangle us with his will, his conditions, his so-called wisdom. He's a parasite." "Enough," Harold said, his voice like steel. "You speak of parasites, yet you're the one feeding on the family. Do you think fire will erase the truth? You'll burn long before this house does." For the first time, Melanie's hand trembled. The match scraped once, twice, refusing to light. Richard appeared at the far end of the hall, his face ashen. "Melanie, stop!" She turned on him, eyes blazing. "You weak fool! Do you want to live under his thumb forever? Don't you see, Richard? This is our chance." But Richard shook his head, voice breaking. "You've gone too far. He's my father." "Your father?" She spat. "He's your executioner." The match finally sparked, flame flaring in her hand. Eleanor screamed, but before Melanie could drop it, Harold wheeled forward with surprising force, striking his cane against her wrist. The match tumbled, fizzled out harmlessly on the polished floor. Melanie cried out, clutching her wrist. Her mask of elegance cracked, fury spilling through. "You think you've won? This isn't over, Harold. Not until you're in the ground." Silence followed her retreating footsteps. Eleanor rushed to Harold's side, tears streaming. "She would have killed us all," she whispered. Harold exhaled slowly. "Number, she would have tried. But she underestimates me. They both do." Richard lingered in the hallway, shame written across his face. "Father, I didn't know she would." Harold cut him off with a sharp glance. "Don't excuse her, Richard. You chose her, and now you'll bear what she's become." Richard's shoulders sagged. For the first time, Harold saw the boy in him, the frightened, broken boy who never grew into a man. That evening, Harold acted. He locked himself in his study and pulled out the small black notebook he kept hidden in a false drawer. Inside were names, numbers, and letters, old allies from his military days, men who owed him favors and still moved quietly in powerful places. He dialed a number, his voice low. "It's Whitmore. I need a file. Background, Melanie Graves. Every thread you can pull." The man on the other end did not hesitate. "Consider it done." When Harold set down the receiver, he leaned back in his chair. His body was tired, but his spirit blazed with renewed fire. If Melanie wanted war, she would have it. Across the hall, Melanie paced like a caged animal. Richard sat slumped on the edge of the bed, his face buried in his hands. "You almost burned us alive," he whispered hoarsely. She snapped her gaze toward him. "You pathetic coward. I'm doing this for us, for you, but you're too blind to see it." "For me?" Richard's voice cracked. "Or for yourself?" Melanie's lips curled. "Does it matter? When he's gone, everything is ours." Richard stared at her, a horrible realization dawning. For years he had blamed his father for every failure, every disappointment. But now, staring at the woman he once loved, he saw the truth. The venom had never been Harold's. It had been Melanie's all along. Downstairs, Harold extinguished the lamps and sat in the darkened parlor. He thought of his years of service, of nights spent in enemy territory where one wrong step meant death. Those nights had sharpened him, taught him patience, and now those same lessons would save his family. He whispered into the silence. "War it is, Melanie, and I've never lost a war." The Whitmore house, once a place of laughter and legacy, had become a battlefield. Its grand halls echoed not with warmth, but with whispered conspiracies and silent wars. Harold knew it, Eleanor felt it, and even Richard, cowardly though he was, could no longer deny it. Melanie, however, thrived in the tension. She carried herself through the estate with the poise of a queen, chin lifted, smile sharp as glass. Servants who once adored Harold now avoided him, frightened by Melanie's icy warnings. The household had divided itself, though no one spoke of it aloud. Some drifted toward Harold out of loyalty, while others feared Melanie's wrath. But Harold did not need their loyalty. He had survived darker places with less. What he needed was proof. That night, after Eleanor retired to her room, Harold returned to his study. The black notebook lay open, a fresh page marked with precise handwriting. Operation Graves. He listed her every movement, every word she spoke at dinner, every glance she cast toward Richard's pocketbook or his own study door. He noted the near arson. He noted Richard's wavering loyalty. He noted Eleanor's fear. Then he marked the corner of the page with a coded symbol, confirmed threat. By morning, a sealed envelope left the estate in the hands of a trusted courier, an old soldier who still addressed Harold as Captain. Inside the envelope, a request for detailed surveillance on Melanie Graves. Meanwhile, Melanie was busy sharpening her knives, not literal ones, but weapons of reputation and poison. At a luncheon with neighbors, she leaned close to Mrs. Cartwright, her voice dripping with false sorrow. "Harold, well, he isn't himself anymore. War takes such a toll, you know. Sometimes he forgets things. Sometimes he lashes out. Eleanor does her best, but how much longer can she bear the strain?" By the end of the afternoon, whispers of Harold's supposed decline had begun circulating through town. Neighbors who once respected him began glancing at him with pity or suspicion, exactly as Melanie intended. Richard noticed the shift too. One evening, as he poured himself a drink in the library, he muttered, "You don't have to drag him through the mud." Melanie's eyes glittered. "Oh, darling, don't be so naive. Do you want the world to believe his version of events when the time comes? Number, we plant the seeds now. When he finally slips, no one will be surprised." Richard swallowed hard, the amber liquid trembling in his glass. For the first time, he wondered if there was still time to pull himself free from her grip, or if it was already too late. Harold was not blind to the rumors. When the minister failed to shake his hand after service, when the butcher offered a discount with a pitying look, when neighbors no longer lingered at the gate, Harold knew, but rather than anger, he felt clarity. Melanie was overplaying her hand. Each lie, each whisper, each seed of doubt, he was collecting them all. And when the time came, he would uproot them in one stroke. One stormy evening, while thunder rattled the windows, Harold received a phone call from one of his contacts. "Whitmore, we dug into her past. She's not who she says she is." Harold leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles tightening on the receiver. "Go on." "Melanie Graves isn't Melanie Graves. Her maiden name's in ruins. She reinvented herself after a scandal in Charleston. There was another marriage, wealthy man. Died mysteriously within 2 years. No charges, but plenty of suspicion. Then she vanished, resurfaced here under a new name." Harold's heart pounded, not with fear, but with grim satisfaction. "Send me everything, every document, every witness. I'll pay whatever it costs. It'll be in your hands within the week." As Harold hung up, lightning illuminated his stern face. The war was no longer a skirmish, it was a siege. The next day, Melanie struck harder. She cornered Eleanor in the garden, her voice low, venomous. "You need to convince Harold to step aside. His time is over. You deserve peace, don't you? Comfort? Think of what life could be without his burdens." Eleanor's hands trembled over the roses she was pruning.
He is my husband. I will not betray him.
Melanie's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the monster beneath. "Then you'll fall with him." Unbeknownst to her, Harold had watched from his study window. His cane tapped once against the floor, a soldier's signal to himself. Enemy position revealed. That night, Harold and Eleanor spoke quietly in their room. "She's trying to turn even you against me," Harold said, his voice a low rumble. Eleanor clasped his hand tightly. "Never. Let her plot and scheme, I stand with you until the end." Harold's eyes softened. "Then we'll endure this storm together, and when the truth comes to light, she'll regret ever stepping foot in this house." But Melanie was not done. Her next move was her boldest yet. At dinner the following evening, she lifted her glass, her smile radiant. "To Harold, may he rest in peace when the time comes." The table fell silent. Richard paled. Eleanor gasped. Harold set down his fork, meeting her gaze with unflinching steel. "Careful, Melanie. Toasts like that can be mistaken for confessions." Melanie only laughed, her voice carrying like broken glass across the table. The war had left the shadows. Now it burned in plain sight. The envelope arrived on a gray morning, heavy with rain and secrets. It was delivered not through the front gate, but slipped discreetly into Harold's study through the back door, carried by the same courier who had once run messages across enemy lines under fire. "Captain," the man whispered, setting the envelope on the desk. "It's all there. Enough to bury her twice." Harold gave a curt nod, slipping him a folded bill. You've done well. Consider this your last mission. The courier saluted and vanished into the mist. Harold sat alone in his study, the rain tapping against the window like the ticking of a clock. He unsealed the envelope with steady hands and unfolded the dossier. Inside was the story of Melanie Graves, if that was even her real name. Her past spilled across the pages in cold ink. Birth name: Margaret Elaine Grafton, born to a modest family in Charleston. First marriage: to a wealthy shipping magnate twice her age. He died suddenly after only 2 years, leaving her a small fortune. No proof of foul play, but the timing was damning. Second identity: after whispers of scandal, she disappeared, reinventing herself as Melanie Graves. Debt trail: unpaid accounts, hushed legal settlements, vanished acquaintances. Current aim: secure the Whitmore fortune through Richard, weak, pliable Richard. At the bottom of the file was a single photograph, a younger Melanie, almost unrecognizable, her smile too wide, her eyes already carrying the hunger Harold knew so well. Harold leaned back, the paper trembling only slightly in his weathered hand. At last, he held a weapon sharp enough to pierce her lies. But Harold was no fool. Weapons meant nothing if unsheathed too early. He needed timing, precision. That night, at dinner, he watched her more closely than ever. Melanie chattered brightly about redecorating the parlor, about replacing that dreadful old portrait of Harold's regiment with something more fashionable. Richard nodded absently, too lost in his drink to resist. Eleanor sat stiffly, silent, her eyes darting to Harold for strength. "And Harold?" He smiled, an expression so calm it unsettled Melanie. For the first time she shifted in her chair, as if sensing the storm gathering behind his eyes. The first trap was baited quietly. 2 days later, Harold called on the family solicitor, Mr. Kendall, under the guise of updating his will. "I want a clause added," Harold said, his voice slow, deliberate. "Anyone found guilty or even suspected of coercion, fraud, or manipulation to secure inheritance shall forfeit all claim to it, every cent." To the sense becoming parting, Kendall frowned. "That is quite unusual." "Unusual, but binding?" "Yes, binding. But Mr. Whitmore, forgive me, are you expecting such attempts?" Harold met his gaze steadily. "Let's just say I've seen this kind of enemy before, and I know how to cut them off before they strike." The solicitor hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. I'll draw it up immediately." Harold left the office with a quiet satisfaction. The walls of his fortress had just grown higher. Meanwhile, Melanie was tightening her own grip on Richard. "You see how he still controls everything?" she whispered to him one evening as they sat by the fire. "He will never let you stand as master of this house. He will never hand over the estate, not until the day he's in the ground." Richard, weary-eyed and restless, stared into his glass. "He's my father, and you've wasted your life in his shadow," Melanie pressed, her hand sliding over his. "When will you claim what's rightfully yours? Or are you content to be nothing?" Richard flinched. "Stop it!" "Then make it stop," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "We can't keep waiting. Sooner or later, the estate will slip from your hands, perhaps into your sister's, perhaps to charity. Do you want that?" Richard said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Harold, however, had anticipated her manipulation. In his study, he kept a second journal hidden in a false drawer, one that Eleanor alone knew existed. In it, he recorded every conversation he overheard, every rumor reported to him. every strange bill or forged signature Melanie orchestrated. Each page was a net, slowly weaving tighter around her. And then by design he let her catch a glimpse of it. One afternoon, Harold left the study door slightly ajar. The black leather book lay conspicuously on the desk. As expected, Melanie slithered in while Harold feigned sleep in the parlor. She rifled through the pages, her breath quickening, her eyes widening as she saw her schemes documented in stark detail. Then she snapped it shut, mask slipping for only a moment. When she turned to leave, Harold's voice cut through the silence. "Find what you were looking for?" Melanie froze. Slowly, she turned. Harold sat in the shadows of the doorway, cane in hand, eyes glinting like steel. "You're delusional," she spat. "Writing fairy tales to make yourself feel important." Harold smiled thinly. "Funny thing about fairy tales, they have a way of revealing monsters." Melanie's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. She brushed past him, her perfume sharp and bitter, her footsteps quick. For the first time, Harold saw fear in her. Only a flicker, but it was enough. That night, Eleanor touched Harold's shoulder as he prepared for bed. "You're playing with fire," she whispered. "I know," Harold said, unbuttoning his shirt with steady hands. "But some fires burn away the rot, and when this one is done, we'll see her ashes scattered to the wind." The storm was building. Both sides knew it. Harold had his dossier, his traps, his allies waiting beyond the estate. Melanie had her poison, her whispers, her hold on Richard's weak heart. The Whitmore house groaned under the weight of secrets, every wall listening, every portrait watching. It would not be long before the first strike landed. The Whitmore estate had grown quieter these past weeks, but it was not the peace of harmony, it was the hush of a battlefield before the charge. Every word at dinner carried a hidden blade. Every glance struck sparks in the air. Melanie felt the shift most keenly. Something had changed in Harold. His silences were heavier, his smiles too deliberate, his eyes watchful as though he knew more than he should. The man she once dismissed as a relic now unnerved her. So she pushed harder. One morning, she cornered Richard in his study, where the brandy bottle was already half empty despite the hour. "You're letting him win," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Richard rubbed his temples. "Melanie, please." "No, you listen to me," she snapped, slamming her hand on the desk. "Every day he grows stronger. Don't you see it? He's setting traps, weaving lies. He's making you out to be the ungrateful son while he plays the martyr. If you don't act soon, we'll lose everything." Richard's shoulders sagged. His voice cracked. "He's my father. I can't." Melanie seized his chin, forcing his gaze to hers. "You can, and you will. Do you want to die a nobody? Do you want Eleanor to inherit the estate? To parade around as mistress of this house while you're left begging at her table?" Richard's eyes filled with confusion, anger, and shame. His hand trembled around the glass, then slammed it onto the desk so hard it cracked. "Stop it!" he roared. "Stop pushing me!" But even as the words echoed, his weakness was laid bare. Melanie smiled faintly, the smile of a puppeteer tugging at strings. That night, Harold staged his first test. Dinner was tense, as usual. The rain hammered the windows, and lightning flashed over the grand dining room, casting shadows across the portraits of Whitmore ancestors. Halfway through the meal, Harold set down his fork with a deliberate clink. "Richard," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I've been thinking about the estate." Melanie's eyes flicked up instantly, sharp as a hawk's 10. Richard hesitated. Yes, father? I've considered revising my will, dividing the estate differently. The silence was suffocating. Eleanor froze, fork halfway to her lips. Harold leaned forward, gaze steady on his son. Tell me, Richard, if the estate were given equally to you and Eleanor both, would that sit right with you? The words were bait, and Harold watched closely. Richard's throat bobbed as he swallowed, glancing at Melanie, who stared back with wide, warning eyes. I suppose it would be fair, Richard muttered weakly. Fair, Harold repeated softly, studying him. And what do you think, Melanie? Her mask cracked for only a heartbeat. I think fairness is overrated, she said coolly, her smile strained. A son should inherit his father's house. That is tradition. Harold tapped his cane against the floor, once, twice. The sound echoed like a drumbeat of judgment. Tradition, he said. Yes, I suppose some traditions are worth keeping. Others, perhaps not. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Melanie's jaw was tight, Richard's hands shook beneath the table, and Eleanor stared at Harold with wide, uncertain eyes. He had seen enough. The test was complete. Later that evening, Eleanor found Harold in his study, gazing into the fire. You shouldn't provoke her, she whispered, closing the door behind her. She's dangerous. Harold's voice was steady, cold. I needed to see how far she'd push him. Now I know. And she'll stop at nothing, Harold said, eyes never leaving the flames. But neither will I. Eleanor's hand trembled as she touched his shoulder. Promise me you won't go too far. Harold finally looked at her, his face worn but unyielding. I've already gone too far to stop. Meanwhile, Richard unraveled. That night, he paced their bedroom like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. He's testing me. He knows something. Why would he say that about Eleanor? He's trying to divide us. Melanie watched him with sharp, calculating eyes. She approached, draping her arms around his shoulders. He's weak, she whispered. Don't let him fool you. You are the rightful heir. He's just an old man clinging to power. Richard's voice cracked. What if he changes the will? What if Eleanor gets it all? Then we make sure he doesn't live long enough to sign it. The words hung heavy in the room, poisonous and sweet. Richard flinched, but Melanie's lips brushed his ear, her voice velvet and steel. Do you trust me? He closed his eyes, shame and fear warring within him. Yes, then let me guide you. Together, we'll take what's ours. Downstairs, Harold lay awake in his bed, listening to the storm lash against the windows. He had heard enough that evening to confirm what he already knew. Melanie would drive Richard to the edge and perhaps beyond. But Harold was ready. In the drawer beside his bed lay two sealed envelopes. One bore Eleanor's name, the other the solicitor's .nest. Inside each was a copy of the dossier, along with Harold's written testimony. If Melanie struck, the truth would not die with him. And so the game continued, each move sharper, each silence heavier. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the blow that would finally shatter it. The Whitmore estate seemed to grow colder with each passing day, though summer sunlight still streamed through its tall windows. It wasn't the weather, it was the people inside. The air was dense with suspicion, deceit, and fear, like a storm gathering above them, waiting to break. Melanie had grown restless. Her patience, once a weapon, was fraying. She prowled through the house like a tigress in a cage, every creak of Harold's cane behind her sending needles of irritation into her skin. You see the way he looks at me, she hissed one afternoon as she followed Richard into the library. He knows. He's taunting us. Richard poured himself another drink, his eyes hollow. Stop it, Melanie. I can't hear this anymore. You can't afford not to hear it, she snapped. Every day he breathes is another chance for him to take everything from you. Do you want Eleanor prancing around with the estate papers in her hand while you drown in brandy? Richard slammed the glass against the table, shattering it. The sound echoed like a gunshot. His face was pale, his chest heaving. Enough, he roared. But even his rage was laced with helplessness. Melanie stepped close, her voice dropping to a hiss. Weakness won't save you. Decide, Richard. Either you stand with me or you lose everything. That evening, Harold watched from the study as Richard staggered across the courtyard, shoulders hunched, face buried in his hands. He saw the way Melanie trailed after him, whispering venom into his ear. Eleanor entered quietly, setting a tray of tea on his desk. Her eyes followed Harold's gaze to the courtyard. He's slipping, Harold murmured. Eleanor nodded, her face tight with worry. She's pushing him past his limits. I hear them at night. She's driving him mad. Harold's jaw tightened. That's her plan. If he falls apart, she controls him completely. Eleanor turned to him, her voice trembling but determined. Then let me help you. No more secrets, Harold. Whatever you're planning, I need to know. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. The fire crackled between them, throwing long shadows across the walls. Finally, he opened the drawer and withdrew a folder thin but heavy with consequence. Inside were photographs, documents, records of conversations Harold had quietly gathered with the help of an old army comrade who now worked in private investigation. Evidence of Melanie's debts, her lovers, her schemes. Eleanor gasped softly as she flipped through the pages. My God, this is enough to destroy her. Harold's eyes burned with cold resolve. That's the idea, but the timing has to be perfect. Too soon, and she'll twist it against us. Too late, and Richard may already be lost. Eleanor closed the folder with trembling hands, but there was steel in her gaze now. Then we time it right. Together. For the first time in weeks, Harold allowed himself the faintest smile. Melanie, however, had no intention of waiting. The next day, she paid a visit to Mr. Gainsborough, the family solicitor, under the pretense of clarifying some household accounts. She sat across from him, draped in pearls, her smile sweet as honey but her words sharp. I do worry about Harold, she said, her tone laced with feigned concern. He's not himself lately. Forgetful, unstable. He talks of revising his will, but in his state, I do wonder if he's truly capable of making such decisions. Mr. Gainsborough stiffened, his pen pausing above the paper. Mrs. Whitmore, those are serious claims. Your father-in-law remains of sound mind in every meeting I've had with him. Melanie's smile didn't falter. Of course, but one must consider appearances. What would the court say if someone questioned his competence? Perhaps it would be wise to prepare a guardianship arrangement just in case. The solicitor's eyes narrowed. He had known Harold for decades. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, such measures cannot be pursued without significant proof, and I should remind you, any attempt to interfere with Harold's affairs without cause would be seen as highly improper. Quos. Melanie's nails dug into the armrest of her chair, but she kept her smile. I only meant to protect the family's interests. She left with no victory, but her ambition only burned hotter. Richard, meanwhile, descended further into despair. Late one night, Eleanor found him in the music room, seated at the piano with his head bowed against the keys. The instrument groaned under his weight, sour notes spilling into the silence. "Richard," she whispered, stepping inside. He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face hollow. "He hates me." "No," Eleanor said gently. "He doesn't." "Yes, he does," Richard insisted, his voice breaking. "I see it in his eyes. He looks at me and sees failure. A drunk, a fool. And he's right." Eleanor knelt beside him, taking his hand. "You are not a fool. You're my brother. You're Harold's son. But you've let Melanie poison you." Richard's hand trembled in hers. "I can't stop her. She knows how to twist everything. I don't know who I am anymore." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Then fight, Richard. Fight for yourself. Don't let her destroy you." But Richard only shook his head, his body racked with silent sobs. Eleanor held him, her heart breaking. She knew Harold's plan was their only hope now. If they waited much longer, there might be nothing left of the brother she loved. Harold sensed it too. That night, as he sat in his study with the dossier spread before him, he whispered into the silence, "It's time." The storm had gathered. Soon it would break. The Whitmore estate was unnervingly quiet that morning. A mist had rolled in from the river, wrapping the old house in a shroud of gray. It seemed fitting. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. In Harold's study, the fire was already lit. Eleanor sat across from him, the folder of damning documents resting between them. She looked at her father, his broad shoulders bent with age, his hands scarred by both war and work, and saw not weakness, but resolve. "Today?" she asked softly. Harold nodded once. "Today. If we wait any longer, Richard will be beyond saving." Eleanor tightened her hands in her lap. "And if she fights back?" "She will," Harold said grimly. "But I've fought worse enemies. The difference is this time I'm not fighting alone." For a moment, their eyes locked, and in that fragile bond lay their strength. Meanwhile, Melanie paced her bedroom like a trapped animal. The solicitor's polite refusal still burned in her chest. She had thought she could manipulate him, twist the law into her weapon. But Harold's reputation was too solid. The town respected him, revered him. She couldn't strike him openly, which left only shadows. "Damn him," she hissed, yanking the pearls from her neck and hurling them across the room. They scattered like shattered teeth across the carpet. She turned on Richard, who sat slumped in the armchair, staring into nothing. "Do you even care?" she spat. "Do you realize he's going to cut you out entirely? Eleanor will have everything, and you'll be left a laughingstock." Richard didn't move. His face was blank, his eyes dull. Melanie's fury ignited. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him hard. "Do something! For once in your life, fight for what's yours." Richard blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. "What if it's not mine?" he whispered. The words chilled her. She released him, her lip curling in disgust. Pathetic. But inside, fear gnawed at her. Richard was unraveling, slipping through her fingers like sand. If he collapsed completely, she would be left to face Harold alone. And that was something she could not afford. Later that afternoon, Harold made his move. He summoned Mr. Gainsborough, the solicitor, to the estate under the pretense of reviewing his affairs. Eleanor was present, sitting with her father as he laid the folder of evidence on the table. The solicitor's eyebrows rose as he flipped through the pages. "Good Lord, everything you need is there," Harold said evenly. "Affairs, debts, manipulation of my son, attempts to interfere with my estate. I need it documented securely. And I want a contingency. Should anything happen to me suddenly, this information is to be released publicly and filed with the court." Mr. Gainsborough looked grave. "You understand, this will destroy her reputation." "That's the idea," Harold said. His voice carried no triumph, only weary certainty. Eleanor reached across and touched her father's hand, as though to anchor him. "We don't want revenge," she said quietly. "We want protection. For Richard. For this family." The solicitor nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll see to it personally." As he left, Harold exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from age or the weight of his decision, Eleanor could not tell. "You've drawn your line," she said softly. Harold looked at her, his eyes dark with memory. "I've drawn many lines in my life, but this is the hardest." But Melanie was sharper than they knew. She sensed the shift almost immediately. That evening, she intercepted Mr. Gainsborough as he left the estate. "Working late, Mr. Gainsborough?" she purred, stepping into his path. The solicitor stiffened. "Just business, Mrs. Whitmore." She tilted her head, her smile deceptively sweet. "Funny, you rarely make house calls unless it's something urgent." Mr. Gainsborough adjusted his hat, his voice clipped. "Confidential matters, I'm afraid." Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. She watched him depart, suspicion flaring like fire in her chest. Something was happening. Harold was moving against her. And if Harold had made his move, she had to strike first. That night, Richard sat alone in the music room again, his head buried in his arms. The piano keys beneath him were cold. He hadn't touched a drink in hours, yet he felt drunk on despair. He heard the door open, but he didn't lift his head. "Go away." It was Eleanor. She walked to him slowly, her voice soft. "Richard, please, don't shut me out." His shoulders shook. I can't live like this, Elle. She's in my head. I hear her voice even when she's not there. I don't know what's mine anymore, my thoughts, my choices, or hers." Eleanor's throat ached with tears. She knelt beside him, taking his hand. "Then let me remind you who you are. You're Richard Whitmore, my brother, Harold's son. You're not weak, you've just been hurt." He turned to her, his face streaked with tears. "What if it's too late?" "It's never too late," Eleanor whispered fiercely. "But you have to choose, Richard. You have to choose us over her." For the first time, she saw a flicker in his eyes, small, fragile, but real. The flicker of a man who wanted to be free. Upstairs, Harold sat in his chair by the fire, staring at the flames. His cane rested against the hearth. He felt the weight of the coming storm pressing on his chest. He knew Melanie would not yield. She was like the enemies he'd fought in the war, ruthless, cunning, relentless. But unlike then, this battle was fought not with bullets, but with hearts and minds. And the soldier in him, though weary, was ready. He whispered into the silence, "Come then, Melanie. Let's finish this." The storm finally broke the following evening. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, rattling the glass in its frames. Thunder rolled low and steady across the hills, like the distant echo of war drums. It was in this charged atmosphere that Melanie made her move. She had been waiting in the library when Harold entered, his cane tapping against the floor, his breath heavy with fatigue. Eleanor followed closely, carrying a tray of tea. "Father," Melanie said sweetly, rising from the chair by the fire. "I thought we might talk privately." Her tone was wrong, too polished, too calm. Eleanor felt the hair on her arms rise. Harold lowered himself into the armchair opposite her, eyes narrowed. "Speak, then." Melanie folded her hands in her lap. Her smile stretched thin. "It's time we settled things. Richard deserves clarity, and so do I. You've made it abundantly clear you prefer Eleanor. That's fine, but let's not pretend you can erase me." "I intend to erase no one," Harold said evenly. "I intend to protect what is mine." She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a hiss. "You think this house is yours? This legacy? You're clinging to scraps of a life that ended the moment you lost your leg. You're a crippled old man, holding us all hostage to your pride." Eleanor flinched, but Harold didn't blink. His face remained calm, though the firelight caught the steel in his eyes. Melanie straightened, her tone icy. "You have two choices. Sign over control of the estate to Richard now, or I'll expose every weakness you've tried to hide. Your failing health, your fragile mind. I'll have you declared incompetent. They'll strip you of everything, Harold, and I'll be standing in the ruins, smiling." Eleanor gasped. "You vile—" "Quiet," Melanie snapped. The silence that followed was broken only by the thunder outside. Then Harold chuckled. It was low, dry, and startlingly calm. "I wondered when you'd show your teeth," he murmured. "I expected fangs. Instead, I find a jackal snapping at shadows." Melanie's face reddened. "You think I'm bluffing?" "No," Harold said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command. "I think you've already lost." He reached to the side table and placed the thick folder of documents before her. Eleanor's hand hovered protectively over it, as if shielding treasure. "Inside is every debt, every false account, every manipulation you've seeded," Harold said. "I've given copies to Mr. Gainsborough. If anything happens to me, or if you continue down this path, your name will be ruined in this town. You will be penniless, cast out. Even Richard will not be able to save you." For the first time, Melanie faltered. Her breath quickened, her eyes darting to the folder like a cornered animal spotting a trap. "That's a lie," she whispered. "It's the truth," Eleanor said firmly. "I've seen it myself. You've underestimated us, Melanie. You thought Father was weak. You thought Richard would never escape your grasp. But you were wrong. You are the one who is exposed." Melanie's hands trembled against her dress. She opened her mouth, but no words came. At that moment, Richard entered. His eyes were hollow from sleepless nights, his clothes wrinkled. He froze in the doorway, seeing the tableau before him, his father calm, Eleanor resolute, Melanie pale and shaking. "What's happening?" he asked hoarsely. Melanie spooned toward him, desperation flooding her face. "Richard, they're lying to you! Your father and sister, they want to destroy us! He's going to disinherit you! He's—" "Enough." Harold's voice cut like a blade. Richard looked between them, his chest heaving. "Is it true? Father, are you cutting me out?" Harold's gaze softened, if only slightly. "I have never wanted to cut you out, Richard. I want to save you from her." The words hung in the air like lightning. Richard staggered back, pressing a hand to his temple. "Save me? You don't understand. I can't breathe without her voice in my head." His knees buckled, and he gripped the doorframe. "She owns me, Father. She's inside me." Eleanor rushed to him, but he pushed her away weakly. He turned to Melanie, his face crumpling. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't." Melanie's mask cracked. For a fraction of a second, Eleanor saw it. The panic, the guilt, the raw hunger beneath her skin. Then Melanie smoothed her features, stepping toward him with trembling arms. "Of course not, darling," she cooed. "They're twisting everything. I love you. I've always loved you." But her eyes darted, just once, toward the folder. Richard saw it, and something in him broke. "You," his voice cracked. "You used me." Melanie reached for him, but he recoiled as if from fire. He stumbled into the hallway, his breath ragged. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered. "I don't know what's mine and what's yours." He pressed both hands to his head, sinking to the floor. "Get out of me!" Eleanor knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around her brother as he shook with sobs. Melanie stood frozen, her outstretched hands trembling. For the first time since she entered the family, she looked powerless. Harold's voice was quiet, almost sorrowful. "This ends tonight, Melanie. Leave this house, or I will end you." Lightning split the sky outside, and thunder rattled the walls. Melanie's face twisted, a mixture of fury and despair. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed from the room, her footsteps echoing through the hall. Silence fell once more, broken only by Richard's weeping. Harold leaned heavily on his cane, his face pale, his body trembling from the confrontation. But in his eyes, there was no weakness, only the grim certainty of a soldier who had faced his enemy and refused to yield. "This battle is not yet over," he murmured. "But the tide has turned." Morning broke gray and heavy after the storm, the estate standing silent as though holding its breath. The corridors smelled faintly of rain and smoke from the dying embers in the hearth. Eleanor woke to find her father already dressed, seated at his writing desk. Papers were spread before him, the ink on his pen still wet. His posture was rigid, but there was a quiet strength in the way his hands moved, steady despite the tremors of age. "Father," she whispered, "you should rest." Harold shook his head. "There will be time for rest later. Today, the family must face its reckoning." Downstairs, Richard sat slumped in the breakfast room, his eyes hollow, his hair unkempt. He hadn't slept. A half-empty glass of brandy sat untouched before him. When Eleanor entered, he lifted his gaze to her, searching her face as though trying to find his reflection there. "Was it all a lie?" he asked hoarsely. "Every word she whispered to me, every promise, was it poison?" Eleanor sat opposite him and clasped his trembling hands. "It wasn't you who was weak, Richard. It was her who preyed on your heart. You can still choose. You can still be free." He shook his head, tears forming. "I don't know who I am without her." Before Eleanor could answer, Harold's cane struck the floor as he entered. He regarded his son with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Then perhaps it is time you found out." Richard lifted his eyes, and for the first time, there was no defiance, only a broken boy staring at the father he had betrayed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Harold's voice trembled. "So am I. Sorry that I could not protect you from her sooner. Sorry that my silence gave her room to coil around you. But it is not too late." He laid a sealed envelope on the table. "The will has been rewritten. You will not find her name anywhere within it." Richard's eyes widened. His lips parted as if to argue, but the words died on his tongue. His gaze fell to the envelope as though it were a gravestone marking the death of everything he had clung to. "Father, please," he croaked. "Don't shut me out." "You shut yourself out," Harold said, his tone firm but not cruel. "But the door remains open if you walk through it alone, without her." The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Richard's breathing came ragged, his fingers tightening on the glass until it shattered in his hand. Blood streaked his palm, and Eleanor cried out, rushing for a cloth. But Richard only stared at the blood dripping onto the table, his expression distant. "All this time, I thought I was the heir. I thought she made me strong. But I see it now. She hollowed me out and filled me with her hunger." His voice broke, and I let her. He rose suddenly, his chair scraping the floor. "I have to end this." "Richard!" Eleanor called. But he was already gone, his footsteps pounding through the hall. They found him in the drive. The storm had left the gravel slick with mud, and there, under the pale morning light, Melanie stood beside her packed car, her coat drawn tight, her face pale but defiant. "Richard," she began, her tone soft and coaxing, "come with me. We can leave all of this behind. Start fresh. No one will chain us. Not your father, not Eleanor, just you and me." Her eyes gleamed with desperation, with the flicker of a predator cornered but still dangerous. Richard staggered toward her, his hands shaking. For a moment, Eleanor feared he would fall back into her grasp, but then he stopped. "No," he whispered. "You don't own me anymore." Melanie's smile faltered. "Richard, you never loved me," he said, his voice rising. "You loved what you could take from me, from all of us." Her mask cracked, the sweetness draining from her face. Her eyes hardened, her lips curling. "You're nothing without me. You'll crawl back, begging, once he casts you aside." Richard shook his head slowly. "Not this time." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady. "Leave, Melanie. You've poisoned this family enough. If you stay, father's evidence will see you ruined in court. If you go, at least you'll have your name what's left of it." For a long moment, Melanie's eyes darted between them. The broken man who had been her puppet, the sister who had become her enemy, and the old soldier watching with silent judgment. Then, with a bitter laugh, she flung her coat into the car and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and without another word, she tore down the drive, mud spraying in her wake. Richard fell to his knees in the gravel, his sobs raw and unrestrained. Eleanor rushed to his side, holding him as though she could anchor him to the earth. Harold stood tall, his hand gripping his cane, his face pale but resolute. "Let her go," he said. "She has no power here anymore." Days turned into weeks. The estate grew quieter, the air lighter, as though a shadow had finally lifted. Richard remained withdrawn, but he began to walk the grounds again, this time without Melanie's voice guiding his steps. Sometimes Eleanor walked with him, sometimes Harold, but more often he went alone, as though relearning the shape of himself. One evening, Harold called them both into the study. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light on the walls lined with books. He looked at his children, his cane resting against his chair, his will lying open on the desk. "This house, this legacy, it is not a prize to be fought over," he said quietly. "It is a trust, one I failed to guard until too late, but no more. Richard, if you wish to remain part of this family, you must walk the path of your own choosing, not one carved by manipulation. Eleanor, you must stand as the steward of this house when I can no longer. The two of you together, if you can forgive each other, may yet restore what was broken." Eleanor reached for Richard's hand. He hesitated, then took it, his grip unsteady but real. Harold's eyes softened, and for the first time in years, a hint of peace crossed his face. "Then perhaps," he murmured, "we may begin to heal." The fire crackled, the storm long gone, leaving only the steady glow of embers. The Whitmore estate still bore its scars, but within its walls, something fragile and necessary had been reborn. The chance for a family, scarred though it was, to rise from the ashes. And in the quiet strength of Harold's gaze, there was the unspoken truth. Though betrayal had torn them apart, it was love bruised, stubborn, enduring that would hold them together.